Hi guys, welcome to another chemical engineering tutorial brought to you by the ChemEng student. In this lesson we're going to take a look at what exactly is a PhD. So we're going to take a look at a series of different definitions and discuss exactly what is entailed in a PhD, what you need in order to achieve it, and what you can get after achieving a PhD. So we're going to answer all the questions associated with what exactly is a PhD. So, in very simple basic terms, a PhD is the highest academic achievement that you can earn. Now I've put in italics here, highest academic, because we're going to touch on this particular point in just a second. But a PhD stands for a Doctor of Philosophy, and it basically entitles you to be deemed as a philosopher within your chosen discipline. And this is through extensive research and a contribution to knowledge, i.e. you come up with something new and you are entitled to add the title doctor to your name based on your extensive knowledge and research in your particular field. Now they typically take between 3 and 4 years full-time study and can last up to 7 years part-time. I know of one PhD whereby it took 10 years in order for it to be completed. So typically though, minimum is 3 years, but that doesn't take into account the additional time constraints for corrections, for the defence, etc. Now it is a challenging but can be a highly fulfilling experience depending on what your motives are for actually pursuing a PhD in itself. If it's purely for vanity reasons, which a lot of people will simply want to do a PhD for the title, then you probably aren't going to get the fulfilling experience that can sometimes be associated with a PhD. A lot of the time people will say a PhD is the worst experience of your life, which for me isn't necessarily true. That's not a real reflection of what a PhD actually is. Now when we talk about the actual definition, so we've covered what is a PhD, but the definition of a PhD can sometimes be misleading depending on who you ask and what their perspective of a PhD actually is. Some will say, as I mentioned, it's the worst experience of your life. Some will say that it is highly fulfilling and one of the best experiences of their life. So it does depend on what your motives actually are. But if we take a look at some of the common phrases and terms that whether you are doing a PhD, whether you have done a PhD, or whether you are considering doing a PhD, the chances are these are the terms that you would have come across at some point. And let us know in the comments if you are doing a PhD, if you finished, or if you're considering, and what your PhD is actually in, because it's a good chance to open to the wider community to see how everybody is interacting with those PhDs. But things like original contribution to knowledge, while that is true, there is an issue with that particular statement with a PhD, because original contribution to knowledge implies that you do something that no one in the entire world has thought of or tried. That is quite misleading, because what generally should be mentioned here is that your contribution to knowledge can be novel, it can be innovative. Doesn't necessarily mean it has to be something that nobody has ever done before. You can take concepts from other people and other researchers, other key points, and combine them into a hybrid system. So the hybrid system is the innovative part, but you're building upon the work of others. That is a completely legitimate, and what 90% of PhDs actually use is their contribution to knowledge. So it doesn't have to be that nobody has thought about it. You're not reinventing the wheel per se. An independent researcher, that's something that PhDs are often told that they are. which is incredibly misleading because having worked with highly experienced academics, having seen that in academia, the best way of progressing is through collaboration. So if you aren't collaborating with other researchers, then you aren't really going to get very far. So saying that a PhD is building you for an independent researcher isn't really the best reflection of what a PhD actually is setting you up for. World leading expert. Now, there is no one in their right mind that can think they study something for 3 years, 4 years, and they are the world leading expert. That is simply not the case. You would be highly naive and highly ignorant if that was your take on, if you do a PhD, you are the world leading expert. That's just not possible. You would be going against people that have studied stuff for in excess of 30 years. So the PhD gives you the foundation in which to become an expert. Doesn't mean that you are an expert. And again, the highest academic qualification achievable. So we mentioned that in the previous slide, but the thing that's potentially misleading here is if you work in academia, everybody has a PhD. So nobody actually cares whether you have a PhD or not. PhD is at the lower end of the pecking order, per se, for academia, because everybody has it. So it depends on how you define highest academic qualification. Now, whilst these are technically true to a certain extent, they aren't fully representative. For me, what I see the definition of a PhD is the combination of innovative ideas, collaborative work, and failure. If you aren't achieving all three of these, then can you really call yourself a PhD student? I know from my research that the pre-screening tests and the initial idea in the proposal is not what is become, that's the outcome. That is simply not the case because things don't work. So if you aren't failing, you aren't trying enough. So you have to be innovative, which means you're going to fail. You're going to have to be collaborative in order to mitigate some of the failure, because you will learn from these professors, these experts in the field, as to potentially why that has failed. So always ask for help and support when you need it. That is essential in order to be a successful PhD student. Now for me, I've come up with my own definition, and this is something that I teach my students through when I teach at university, but also what I teach and coach through our company, the ChemEng Student. So for me, a PhD is a journey of intellectual evolution, the culmination of relentless setbacks with the ability to push the boundaries of what was once not known. So for me, I feel that summarizes everything in a nice, neat package, because it's telling you that your intellectual ability will improve over time, it will evolve. It will be the culmination of failure, setbacks, things won't work. But then you're also going to be contributing to what was at one point unknown. So that's the innovative novelty of the work. So that's my take on what a PhD actually is. Now, in terms of the types of programs that are available, there's generally 3 PhD programs. You can have the research PhD, which is predominantly the most common, whereby you do solid research for 3 to 4 years full time, and at the end you will defend your paper and then you'll be awarded a PhD. You can get top PhDs, whereby it's similar to a master's or postgraduate, whereby you will have taught classes and modules, but then you'll have a research element as well. And again, these can last for several different years. And then finally, you can have what's called a PhD by publication. Now, this isn't as common as the other one, certainly not here in the United Kingdom. is that PhD by publication simply means that you've published enough papers in peer-reviewed journals with high impact factors that says that your work is suitable for academia. So you would be presented with a PhD by publication. There is a fourth PhD that is an honorary PhD, usually given to celebrities and high-ranking officials. But for me, I feel that that's not a true reflection of what a PhD actually is. So I would argue that there is 3 routes for PhDs. Now, what is the associated cost of doing a PhD? Because depending on where you go and depending on the institution, a PhD can be a very costly endeavour. And from my experience here in the UK, the funding route is usually self-funded, whereas in the United States, in Australia, Canada, a lot of European countries, they are funded through scholarships. But in the UK, it's more common that you are self-funded. Now, I personally was self-funded. I have made another fully comprehensive video on my personal PhD journey. I'll put a link in the description to that once the video is out. And you can learn more in detail about my overall experience of the PhD, the costs associated with it, the ups, the downs, the highs and the lows. But the major bottleneck, as I mentioned in the UK, is that PhD research programs are really limited to the availability of the funding, because it isn't cheap. It really isn't cheap, especially if you are an international student wanting to study in the UK. It's really not cheap. But there are, however, several options for scholarships and funding, and this is just in general through different countries as well. Is you have Research Council grants and bursaries, you can have industry sponsorships, or you can even have a PhD loan as well. So these are alternative routes for getting funded for a PhD. Now, as I mentioned, they can be a very costly endeavour, and depending on where you go around the world, the cost will vary. So within the UK, it can vary between nearly $6,000 to $44,500. Now, I've kept it all in USD because that's like the universal currency. Whereas, you look at the US, it can be anywhere above $26,000. So it depends on where you go. Whereas Asian countries tend to be slightly cheaper. Here we've got Japan, which is between $5,000 and $6,000. So it really varies depending on country to country and whether you are a home student or an international student. But these prices are only the cost of the program. You need to factor in the living expenses within the total price. So the total price here could skyrocket. You could be tens of thousands of dollars every year for the program, a minimum of 3 years. So it is a huge commitment doing a PhD financially, as well as by your time as well. So what is the PhD journey then? So we know what a PhD is, we've defined a PhD, we know that it's expensive, but what's the actual journey? And it varies depending on the different types of factors and the association of your PhD. Whether it's industry funded, whether it's industry driven, whether it's very theoretical, whether it's experimental, so forth. But a typical PhD journey in general is you begin with preparing a research proposal, and that's what you would use for the application, and that's what you're going to use as your baseline for your literature review, which comes at the second point, whereby you now for me, I recommend at least 6 months to do a comprehensive literature review, which means you look at all the work that has been done within your field and the slightly wider field encompassing your topic, and you see what's been done, what's the comments, what's the outcomes, what's the limitations, and that allows you to formulate your research questions. And then what that will allow you to do is develop and then conduct your research, because ultimately you're going to have to plan what you do and you're going to have to execute it, and then you're going to have to analyze it. to come up with conclusions, to summarise the data, to provide something new. Now, we have a thing in the UK called the transfer event, and the transfer event can take place usually halfway through your programme, because even though you're on a PhD programme, at the beginning you're actually registered as an MPhil, which is one less than a PhD. It's like a master's with research. Now, the transfer event is basically like a mini defence of your work to see if you are on track to achieve a PhD or whether it should be downgraded to an MPhil. But it gives you a taste of the viva at the end. And the viva is like a defence of your work. So it's like a presentation, and then you'll have experts within the field that will question you for you to justify your work. And that's the final part, is you write the thesis, you submit it to the doctoral college, and you defend it, and so forth. Now, the possible outcomes of a PhD is rather difficult to fail a PhD, but the typical outcomes are you have an outright fail. And I've only known a select few people that have outright failed the entire thing. That is very, very rare. You have passed with major corrections, which means you pass the viva, you pass the defence, but you have significant gaps within your research methodology. So you have to, maybe 12 months worth of going back, fixing things, changing things, making the alterations. You then have passed with minor corrections, which is usually where the majority of people sit, is they pass with minor corrections. And what that basically means is, I've seen external examiners pick on grammar, spelling, you've missed a full stop here. So these are small corrections maybe on the language used, the way you've described something, you maybe just need to polish it ever so slightly. And then the final one, which I'm sure everybody would love, is an outright pass. You do the viva, you do the defence, and they say, congratulations, you've passed. No corrections whatsoever. It's perfect. That in general doesn't really happen. I've heard of that a couple of times, but generally speaking, pass with minor corrections is what 99% of PhD students achieve after submission and after the defence. Now, my final thoughts and advice for anybody that is just starting a PhD or considering doing a PhD is that to be accepted on the programme means that you have the potential and you have what it takes to pass and be a success in a PhD programme. If you weren't, you wouldn't have been granted the opportunity. So overcoming that thoughts of maybe self-deprecation, that are you good enough? Is this really for you? If you weren't good enough, you wouldn't have been accepted onto the programme. Now, for me, my quote that I usually give all my students is, regardless of whether it's a PhD or research in academia or even in work life in general, is that don't be afraid to ask for help. You're starting off. You need to ask the right people. Prioritise your time and not your pride. You don't have to sit endlessly for weeks trying to master a concept when it would be very easy and quick to email a professor and have them explain it very quickly. That's what I do, and that's why I gained so much knowledge in such a short space of time, because I asked the relevant right people. Now, you also have to remember that your assessors, your examiners, your fellow colleagues, your supervisor, they've all been through the same thing. They all have PhDs as well. So they can sympathise with you, so don't be intimidated by these other professionals, because they at one point were in exactly the same position that you were in. So never ever feel intimidated because you are a PhD student and these people already have a PhD. They were in exactly the same position, so they will sympathise with you. They understand the struggles that you're going through. So talk to them. We have drop-in sessions through the ChemEng student, whereby we offer help, advice, hints and tips for surviving university in general. So, you know, please feel free to get in contact if that's something that you are interested in. So that's the end of this lesson. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this was helpful in truly understanding what a PhD actually is, what is required, and help you in a decision as to whether or not a PhD is something that you think that you should, you know, take on in the next 3 to 4 years. Now again, there will be a subsequent video on my personal PhD journey that goes into copious amounts of detail. So, you know, I'll put a link in the description when that comes out, and we hope to see you there. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us reach as many students as possible. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to seeing you in another video.